Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's stories begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And a little note before we begin. You may notice a few brief ads in the first 10 minutes, but after that, the rest of the video is completely ad-free. Just you, the silence, and the stories. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the night carry you. If you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. A good friend of mine told me this story years ago, and even now it's difficult to sit with. Not because it involves anything supernatural or unexplained, but because it's grounded in something far worse. How easily ordinary life can hide something horrific, and how close you can be to it without realizing. At the time, my friend was going to school in Munich. She was young, focused on her studies, and trying to make a life for herself in a city that was still new to her. Like a lot of students, she lived in shared housing. The apartment wasn't luxurious, but it was affordable and close enough to campus to make daily life manageable. It was the kind of place where people came and went. Schedules overlapped and privacy was respected, mostly because everyone was busy with their own lives. She shared the apartment with another student, a girl who, at first, didn't raise any red flags. She was quiet, a little intense maybe, but not enough to stand out. Plenty of people are awkward or reserved when they're living with strangers. It didn't seem strange at the time. If anything, my friend thought she was just private and serious about school. This roommate had a boyfriend. He came over often in the beginning, not every day, but enough that his presence became familiar. He wasn't loud or disruptive. He didn't cause problems in the apartment. My friend remembers him as polite, if a little distant. He kept to himself, spent most of his time in the roommate's room, and didn't interact much beyond basic greetings. He was just there. Then one day he wasn't. At first, it didn't feel significant. People drift apart. Relationships end. Sometimes partners stop coming around without any announcement. My friend assumed they'd broken up or that he was busy with his own life. She didn't ask questions, and neither did anyone else. It wasn't her business. Not long after that, her roommate made a strange decision. She said she wanted to use the attic for storage. The apartment had an attic space that wasn't used much. It was accessible, but it wasn't somewhere people went regularly. It was dusty, awkward to move things into, and generally ignored. When her roommate brought it up, she said she needed more room for her things. She talked about boxes, old clothes, books, things like that. Then she said she wanted to close it up and move into one of the lower rooms instead. That struck my friend as a little odd. Most people would want the larger, more private space, not the other way around. But again, people make strange choices all the time. Maybe she wanted a room closer to the bathroom. Maybe she didn't like the attic anymore. My friend didn't push. She didn't ask many questions. Life went on. Weeks passed. Then months. Over time, my friend began to feel uncomfortable in the apartment. But she couldn't immediately explain why. It wasn't anything concrete. There were no obvious threats, no direct confrontations, just a slow, growing sense that something was off. Her roommate's behavior changed. She became more withdrawn, but not in a quiet, sad way. It was sharper than that. Her moods shifted unpredictably. Sometimes she was overly cheerful, almost forced in her friendliness. Other times she was cold, distant, barely acknowledging my friend's presence. Conversations felt strained and unnatural, like my friend was constantly saying the wrong thing without knowing why. There were also practical oddities. Doors were locked more often. Certain areas of the apartment felt off limits, without being explicitly stated. The attic in particular was suddenly not to be discussed. Any mention of it was brushed off quickly, sometimes with irritation. My friends started spending less time at home. She stayed late at school. She visited other friends more often. She slept elsewhere when she could. It wasn't fear, exactly. More like discomfort that kept growing until it felt heavy. Eventually, she reached a point where she knew she couldn't live there anymore. She moved out. It wasn't dramatic. She gave notice, packed her things, and left. She didn't accuse her roommate of anything. She didn't confront her. She just trusted her instincts and removed herself from a situation that didn't feel right. At the time, she thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. Sometime after she moved out, my friend received a call that turned everything upside down. She was contacted by authorities and told that they needed her to speak in court. Her former roommate was on trial. At first, my friend didn't understand why she would be involved. She hadn't been harmed. She hadn't witnessed a crime. She hadn't even been living there anymore when whatever happened occurred. Then they told her why. Her former roommate, along with a new boyfriend and another friend, had been caught trying to dispose of a man's body in the garden. The body had been there for months, in the attic. The same attic her roommate had suddenly wanted to use for storage. The same attic she had closed off. The same attic that had become a silent, forbidden space in the apartment. The man was the old boyfriend. He hadn't stopped coming around because the relationship ended. He had stopped coming around because he was dead. The details came out slowly, piece by piece, and each one was worse than the last. My friend learned that the murder had happened while she was away on vacation. That timing alone made her feel sick. She had been gone, living her life, enjoying time away, while something unimaginable happened in the place she had been calling home. According to the investigation, the roommate had planned it. She used intimacy to lower his guard. She created a situation where he felt safe, where he trusted her completely. When he was vulnerable, when his awareness was compromised, she killed him. The method itself was brutal, but what made it truly horrifying wasn't the tool. It was the betrayal, the calculated nature of it. The fact that this wasn't a crime of sudden rage, but something deliberate. Afterwards, she hid his body, not for days, for months. She lived in the same apartment. She went to school. She interacted with people. She slept, ate, laughed, and acted like nothing had happened, all while a dead man was hidden just above her living space. All while my friend walked those halls, used that apartment, and sensed something was wrong without ever knowing why. Eventually, she couldn't keep it hidden forever. She involved others, a new boyfriend, another friend. Together, they tried to dispose of the body in the garden, thinking they could erase what she had done. That's when they were caught. When my friend was asked to speak at the trial, it felt surreal. She wasn't there to testify about the crime itself. She was there to talk about behavior, about changes, about the attic, about the way her former roommate had acted during that time. She had unknowingly been living alongside the aftermath of a murder. That realization haunted her. She kept replaying memories, looking for moments that might have been warnings, conversations that felt strange, the tension in the apartment, the sense of unease that eventually drove her out. She wondered what would have happened if she hadn't trusted that feeling, if she had stayed longer, if she had gone into the attic, if she had asked the wrong question at the wrong time. The trial confirmed everything. The roommate was convicted. The details became public. The story spread quietly, then loudly through social circles. People reacted with shock, disbelief, and horror. Those who had known her struggled to reconcile the person they thought they knew with what she had done. What stuck with my friend the most wasn't just the crime. It was how normal everything had seemed on the surface. This wasn't some dark, isolated cabin in the woods. It wasn't a place people avoided. It was a student apartment in a city full of life. People came and went every day. Neighbors lived their own lives. No one suspected that a body was hidden just above their heads. It forced my friend to confront an uncomfortable truth. You don't always get clear warning signs. Sometimes danger doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with obvious threats or dramatic behavior. Sometimes it's just a feeling you can't quite explain, a subtle shift in someone's presence, a growing discomfort that doesn't have a clear source. And sometimes, listening to that feeling's the only thing that keeps you safe. She often says that leaving that apartment might have saved her life, even if she can't prove it. Not because she knows her roommate would have harmed her, but because someone capable of that level of violence and deception is unpredictable. Living in close proximity to that kind of person is a risk in itself. The idea that she slept under the same roof as a hidden body, that she shared space with someone who had committed such an act, still makes her uneasy. Even years later, she can't fully shake it. It changed how she looks at people, how she trusts, how she listens to her instincts. What makes the story especially disturbing is how ordinary it begins. A roommate, a boyfriend, a student apartment, a city full of people just trying to get through school and life. Nothing about it feels like the setup for something so extreme. And yet that's exactly how it unfolded. There's no ghost here, no unexplained presence, no paranormal mystery. Just a human being who chose to do something horrific and managed to hide it in plain sight for months. That's what makes it hard to forget, because it reminds you that sometimes the scariest things aren't things you don't understand. They're things you understand all too well. When I was about 7 or 8 years old, I lived at home with my mom and dad in what felt like a completely normal, safe house. At that age, home is the center of your world. It's where you sleep, where you play, where you assume nothing truly bad can happen. I didn't understand danger the way adults do. I understood rules, bedtime, and the comfort of familiar sounds in the night. That night started like any other. I was in my bedroom, half asleep, half awake, the way kids often are in the middle of the night. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in once adults have gone to bed and the world outside has slowed down. Then I heard voices. At first, the sound didn't scare me. It was men talking in the kitchen. Low voices, not shouting, not whispering either, just talking, calm, casual. The kind of sound that feels ordinary when you're a kid. I remember thinking it was my dad. My dad sometimes had friends over. He had co-workers, neighbors, people he'd talk to late into the evening. In my half-awake mind, that explanation made sense. There was no panic, no immediate fear, just curiosity. I got out of bed. I opened my bedroom door slowly and stepped into the hallway. The house was dark, lit only by faint light coming from downstairs. I walked toward the top of the stairs and stopped there, hovering just out of sight. From where I stood, I could hear the voices more clearly, but I still couldn't see anyone. I listened. The voices were definitely male. More than one. They weren't laughing loudly or making noise like a party. It sounded controlled, focused. I couldn't make out words clearly, but the tone didn't feel playful. Something about that made me pause. I stood there for a long time. I don't know how long exactly. Time feels strange when you're that young, especially in the middle of the night. It could have been a minute. It could have been 10. I remember standing there, holding onto the banister, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to go downstairs. I wanted to see who it was. I wanted to say hi. I wanted reassurance that everything was normal. Kids crave confirmation from adults, even when they don't realize it. But another part of me hesitated. I didn't feel terrified. There was no screaming voice in my head telling me to run. It was quieter than that. Just a feeling that said, maybe I shouldn't go down there. Maybe I should stay where I was. Maybe I should go back to bed. I remember thinking that if it really was my dad and his friends, oh, it wouldn't matter if I stayed upstairs. I could always ask about it in the morning. So I turned around. I went back to my room and got into bed. I don't remember falling asleep, only that eventually the house went quiet again. No voices, no movement, nothing out of the ordinary. The next morning, I woke up to screaming. It wasn't the kind of scream you hear in movies. It was raw, panicked, full of shock and disbelief. My mom's voice cut through the house in a way I had never heard before. It pulled me out of bed instantly. I ran out of my room and down the stairs. The house looked wrong. Drawers were open. Cabinets were hanging ajar. Things were on the floor that weren't supposed to be there. The order that made the house feel safe had been broken. My mom was standing in the kitchen, crying and yelling at the same time. I trying to understand what she was seeing. My dad was moving around the house, checking doors, checking windows, his face tight with anger and confusion. Our house had been robbed. Not just someone sneaking in and taking one thing. It was clear that whoever had been there felt comfortable. They had time. They went through our belongings, our private spaces, things that were supposed to be ours alone. That was the moment something clicked in my mind. The voices, the men talking in the kitchen. It hadn't been my dad, it hadn't been friends. It had been the people who were robbing our house. I didn't say anything at first. I didn't fully understand how to explain it. I was a kid, and I didn't want to get in trouble. I didn't even know if what I remembered mattered. But the realization sat heavy in my chest. The police came. They walked through the house, asked questions, took notes. They dusted for fingerprints. They told my parents things that sounded reassuring on the surface, but didn't actually make us feel safer. They said burglaries happen. They said it was probably random. They said we should lock doors and windows more carefully. Then it happened again. Not long after the first break-in, our house was robbed a second time. Same feeling, same violation, same helplessness. It felt less like bad luck and more like something deliberate. The police response didn't change much. Reports were filed, notes were taken, promises were made. Nothing came of it. Then it happened a third time. By then, my mom was done trusting that someone else would handle it. She was furious, scared, and exhausted. Our home didn't feel like a refuge anymore. It felt like a place someone else could enter whenever they wanted. The police still didn't have answers. No suspect, no arrest, no meaningful progress. So my mom did something unexpected. She started her own investigation. She paid attention to patterns, timing, what was taken, what wasn't. She talked to neighbors. She listened. She trusted her instincts in a way she hadn't before. She stopped assuming this was random and started assuming it wasn't. She realized something terrifying. Whoever was doing this knew our routine. They knew when we were home. They knew when we weren't. They knew how to get in quietly. They knew where to go in the house. They weren't just stealing. They were watching. That knowledge changed everything. We started locking doors obsessively. We checked windows before bed. Every sound at night made my heart race. I slept lighter. I listened harder. I learned fear earlier than most kids do. Months passed. Then the story took a turn that none of us were prepared for. The man who had been robbing our house was caught, but not for robbery. He went on to kill 2 people. One was a student from Duke University. The other was a student from University of North Carolina. When my parents found out, the weight of it crushed the room into silence. There was no relief, only horror. The realization that the person who had been inside our home, walking through our kitchen, talking with others in the dark, had later taken lives, real lives, young lives, students with futures that never happened. That's when my parents sat me down and asked me something they hadn't before. They asked if I had ever heard anything strange at night. I told them about the voices. I told them about standing at the top of the stairs. I told them about how I almost went down. The room went quiet in a way that felt heavier than any shouting ever could. My mom cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just tears falling as she imagined what could have happened. My dad sat with his head in his hands, replaying the idea of me walking into that kitchen alone. Who knows what would have happened if I had gone down those stairs? That question has never left me. The man was already comfortable enough to break into our house multiple times. Comfortable enough to stand in our kitchen and talk. Comfortable enough to return again and again. Comfortable enough to escalate to murder later on. If I had gone downstairs, I wouldn't have understood danger. I would have assumed they were supposed to be there. I was small, quiet, easy to control. Sometimes survival comes down to instinct you don't even recognize as instinct. I didn't stay upstairs because I was brave. I stayed upstairs because something small and quiet inside me said to wait. As I got older, I understood how close that night was to changing everything. Not just for me, but for my family. I understood how easily a child's curiosity could have led to something irreversible. What haunts me isn't just the crime. It's how ordinary it felt at the time. Men talking in a kitchen. A kid listening on the stairs. A decision made without understanding the stakes. The fact that the police didn't help much at the time adds another layer of anger and frustration. If something had been done earlier, if patterns had been taken seriously, if intervention had happened sooner, maybe those 2 students would still be alive. Maybe that man wouldn't have had the chance to escalate. But that's the thing about hindsight. It shows you the shape of danger only after it has passed. Growing up, I carried that story quietly. I didn't talk about it often. It wasn't something that came up naturally in conversation. But it shaped me. It made me aware of how thin the line is between normal and catastrophic. How danger doesn't always announce itself with loud noises and obvious threats. Sometimes it sounds like casual conversation in the next room. Sometimes it looks like a choice not to walk down a staircase. Even now, as an adult, I think about that night, about how close it came, about how easily the story could have ended differently, about how many lives were affected by one person who went unnoticed for too long. And I think about the students who never got the chance to grow older. I think about their families. I think about how violence ripples outward, touching people who never even knew the person responsible. And I think about the fact that I'm here, not because of strength, not because of courage, but because at 7 or 8 years old, I chose to stay where I was and go back to bed. Sometimes that's all it takes. And sometimes that's all that stands between a normal childhood memory and something that would have followed me forever. My grandfather told me this story once late at night, the way older people sometimes do when the past feels closer than the present. He didn't tell it to scare me or teach a lesson. He told it almost casually, as if it were just another strange thing that happened in a long life. But the more he talked, the more I realized how close it came to ending everything before it ever really began. He was a teenager at the time, young enough to feel invincible, old enough to have a driver's license, and living in a period where consequences felt abstract and distant. Back then, going out with friends meant something different. There weren't rideshare apps. There wasn't the same level of social pressure around drinking and driving. People did reckless things because everyone around them did the same reckless things, and somehow most of them survived long enough to tell stories about it later. That night, he and a friend decided to go out to a bar. Even now, when he talked about it, there was a hint of disbelief in his voice, like he couldn't quite understand how easily they'd made that decision. They were underage, obviously, but that wasn't much of a barrier at the time. Fake confidence, loose enforcement, and a culture that treated heavy drinking as a rite of passage made it easy. They drank a lot. Not a couple beers, not a buzz. They got hammered. Drunk enough that details blurred together. Drunk enough that judgment was gone long before they realized it. Drunk enough that the idea of getting behind the wheel didn't register as dangerous, just necessary. At some point, they decided it was time to go home. They stumbled out of the bar and into the car, laughing, loud, loose, careless. My grandfather was driving. He doesn't remember much about the road at first. Just darkness, headlights cutting through it in a narrow cone, the hum of the engine, his friend talking too loudly in the passenger seat. The road they were on wasn't well lit. It was rural, quiet, with long stretches where nothing broke the darkness, no traffic, no streetlights, just pavement, trees, and the sense that the world existed only as far as their headlights reached. Somewhere along the way, he lost control. It wasn't dramatic at first. There was no sudden crash, no violent impact. The car drifted. The tires left the road. Then gravity took over. The vehicle slid down into a ditch beside the road, bouncing and jolting until it came to a stop. They were shaken, but alive. For a moment, they just sat there, trying to process what had happened. The car wasn't completely wrecked. It was stuck, tilted awkwardly, but the engine still ran. No airbags had gone off, no blood, no obvious injuries. To drunk teenagers, that felt like a win. Then they realized where they were. The ditch wasn't just a ditch. At the bottom of it ran train tracks, steel rails stretching into darkness in both directions, cutting through the land in a straight, unforgiving line. The kind of tracks that make you feel small even when you're sober. In that moment, any reasonable person would have gotten out of the car and waited, or walked, or called for help, or done anything except what they did next. But they weren't reasonable. They were drunk, embarrassed, scared of consequences, and still convinced they could think their way out of the situation. They looked at the tracks and made an assumption that would almost kill them. They thought the tracks would eventually cross a road. It sounds ridiculous when you say it out loud, but at the time it made sense to them. Tracks had to intersect roads somewhere, right? If they followed them long enough, they'd reach a crossing, a way out, a place where they could get back onto pavement and drive home like nothing had happened. So they did the unthinkable. They drove the car onto the tracks, metal tires against metal rails, the car scraping and lurching as they lined it up. It wasn't smooth, it wasn't quiet, but it moved. Slowly, awkwardly, but forward. In their minds, that was proof enough that the plan would work. They started driving down the tracks. At first, there was laughter again. Nervous laughter, but laughter all the same. The absurdity of it, the adrenaline, the belief that they'd somehow outsmarted a bad situation. The world felt surreal, like a game where the rules didn't fully apply. Then they saw the light. At first, it was just a glow in the distance behind them. Faint, easy to dismiss. One of them joked about it. Maybe it was another road, maybe it was nothing. But the light grew brighter and louder. The sound came next. A low rumble, distant at first, then unmistakable. The deep, rolling vibration that only one thing in the world makes. A train coming up behind them. The realization hit like ice water. They were on active tracks, in a car, with a train approaching from behind. Panic replaced laughter instantly. My grandfather said that moment sobered him up more than anything else ever had. Fear has a way of cutting through alcohol in a way nothing else can. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. His heart slammed against his ribs. His mouth went dry. He tried to accelerate. The car struggled. The rails limited traction. The uneven surface made it hard to gain speed. They weren't moving nearly fast enough. The train was closing the distance quickly, its headlights flooding the tracks with blinding white light. The horn blasted, long, deafening blasts that shook the air and rattled the inside of the car. The sound wasn't just loud. It was commanding, primal, impossible to ignore. It said one thing clearly and without mercy. Move. The conductor saw them. The train didn't slow immediately. Trains can't. They're massive, heavy, and governed by physics that don't care about human mistakes. But the conductor did the only thing he could. He slammed the brakes. Metal screamed against metal. Sparks flew beneath the train as it tried to slow. The horn kept blaring, not in warning anymore, but in desperation. The train reached them before it could stop. It didn't crash into the car at full speed. Instead, it made contact and began pushing it forward along the tracks. The sensation was surreal. The car jolted violently, the sound overwhelming, the world reduced to noise, vibration, and terror. They were being pushed by a train, inside the car, fully aware that at any moment it could crumple, flip, or be dragged under the massive engine behind them. My grandfather said he remembers screaming. Not words, just noise. His friend was screaming too. The car shook as the train continued to slow, the brakes fighting momentum inch by inch. Seconds felt like hours. Every bump felt like the one that would end it. Every jolt made them brace for the car to collapse. He said he thought, very clearly, that this was how he was going to die. Not dramatically, not heroically, but stupidly, because of one bad decision layered on top of another. Then, slowly, impossibly, the train stopped. The car came to rest on the tracks, damaged but intact enough to hold together. The horn cut off. The noise faded. The night returned, broken only by the ticking of the engine and the distant sounds of the world continuing as if nothing extraordinary had happened. They sat there in silence, shaking, breathing hard, alive. The conductor ran back toward them, shouting, furious and terrified all at once. My grandfather doesn't remember exactly what he said, only that his voice carried the weight of someone who had just come inches away from killing two teenagers and living with that forever. Authorities were called. Questions were asked. Consequences followed. Though my grandfather never went into much detail about that part. What mattered wasn't the punishment. What mattered was the realization that settled in afterward. They had survived something they absolutely should not have. They had been seconds away from being crushed, dragged, or killed outright. If the conductor had seen them even a moment later, if the brakes hadn't held, if the car had slipped differently on the rails, there would have been no story to tell. When my grandfather finished telling it, he didn't dramatize the ending. He didn't pause for effect. He just sat there, quiet for a moment, then shrugged slightly, like someone acknowledging a fact they'd long ago accepted. He said that night stayed with him forever. Not as a nightmare, but as a marker, a dividing line between the person he was before and the person he became after. He never drove drunk again. Not once. Not even after a single drink. He never joked about it. Never excused it. The fear had burned itself too deeply into him. What strikes me most about the story isn't just the danger. It's how close everything came to never happening afterward. If he had died that night, my parent would never have been born. I would never have existed. Entire branches of a family tree erased because of a choice made by a drunk teenager who thought he could outsmart a bad situation. It's strange to think that so much can hinge on moments like that. On a conductor seeing headlights in time, on brakes working just enough, on physics allowing a miracle instead of a tragedy. My grandfather never called it luck. He called it a warning. A warning he survived long enough to understand. And every time I hear a train horn in the distance, I think about two drunk teenagers on a set of tracks, a wall of metal bearing down on them, and a life that almost ended before it really began. Not because of fate, but because of a choice. A friend of ours was murdered when we were in middle school, and even now it's hard to put into words how deeply it shook everything around us. At that age, death still feels abstract. It's something you hear about on the news or in stories, not something that reaches into your own life and takes someone you know. When it does, it changes the way the world feels, especially when the circumstances are as brutal as these were. She was just a kid, one of us, someone we saw in class, laughed with, complained about homework with. There was nothing unusual about the day it happened. She was at the mall with her friend, doing what middle schoolers do, walking around, killing time, feeling a little bit grown up just by being there, without adults hovering. At some point, she needed a ride home. She did what most kids are taught to do. She called someone she trusted. She called her uncle. There was no hesitation, no fear, no reason to think twice. Family is supposed to be safe. Family is supposed to protect you. That trust is what makes what happened next so hard to process. Instead of taking her home, he drove her out of the city, away from people, away from anywhere she could run or call for help. He took her to a trailer, isolated and hidden enough that no one would hear or see what he was about to do. What happened there was monstrous. He raped her. He murdered her. The details were more than anyone should ever have to hear about a child. Even now, most of us avoid thinking too closely about what she must have gone through in those final moments. The fear, the confusion, the betrayal, the realization that the person she trusted with her safety was the one hurting her. Afterward, he killed himself. There was no arrest, no trial, no long investigation that slowly brought answers. Everything ended in violence, leaving nothing behind but devastation and unanswered questions. The person responsible never had to face consequences in the way people usually think of justice. He took the easy way out, leaving everyone else to live with what he had done. But somehow, the story didn't end there. The worst part, the detail that still makes people fall silent when it's mentioned, is who found them. Her other uncle, her father's brother. He was the one who went to the trailer. How he knew where to go or what led him there isn't something people talk about much. Maybe he was looking for her. Maybe something felt wrong. Maybe he followed a trail of worry that led him straight into a nightmare. He walked into that trailer and found his niece, and he found his brother. The shock of that moment is impossible to imagine. To see someone you love murdered. To realize the person who did it is your own blood. To have all of that hit you at once, without warning, without time to prepare your mind or heart for it. When the police arrived, they didn't find him calm or composed. They found him covered in blood. Not because he had hurt his niece, but because he had been beating his brother's body. Beating him even though he was already dead. Beating him because there was nowhere else for the rage, grief, and horror to go. It's hard to judge someone in a moment like that. What do you do when every rule of reality collapses at once? When love, betrayal, violence, and loss all exist in the same room? His reaction wasn't rational, but it was human. A completely broken response to something that should never happen. For those of us who knew her, the aftermath felt unreal. School went on, but nothing felt normal. Desks were empty. Teachers spoke softly. Counselors were suddenly everywhere. People cried in hallways. Some kids didn't understand what had happened. Others understood too much, too quickly. It changed how we saw the world. Adults always tell kids that family will keep you safe. That if you're in trouble, you should call someone you trust, someone close to you. This story shattered that idea in the worst possible way. It taught us, far too young, that danger doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from the people you're told to trust without question. It also left a deep scar on her family. Her parents lost a daughter. An uncle lost a niece and a brother in the same moment. A family was torn apart in a way that can never be repaired. There's no moving on from something like that, only learning how to live with it. Even years later, when people talk about her, the conversation usually goes quiet. Not because she's forgotten, but because remembering hurts. She's frozen in time as a middle school, while everyone else grew up, graduated, moved away, built lives she never got the chance to have. What makes this kind of story especially heavy is that there's no meaning to pull from it. No lesson that makes it easier to accept. No silver lining. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't something that could be explained away. It was pure violence, rooted in betrayal. For those of us who were kids at the time, it forced us to grow up too fast. It showed us that the world isn't just unfair in abstract ways. It can be cruel in very personal ones. It can reach into ordinary moments, like a phone call for a ride home, and turn them into something irreversible. Even now, thinking about it brings up the same feeling it did back then. A mix of sadness, anger, and disbelief that something so horrific could happen to someone so young at the hands of someone who was supposed to protect her. She deserved to grow up. She deserved a future. And the fact that she didn't is something that never really stops hurting. I was riding with my brother in his truck, following behind my mom and dad in their vehicle. We had gone out fishing earlier that afternoon. Nothing special, just one of those calm, familiar days where everything feels routine. The weather hadn't seemed threatening when we left. Cloudy, maybe, but nothing unusual enough to make us cancel plans. Then the rain came. Not gradually, not politely. It hit like someone flipped a switch. The sky darkened fast, and within minutes the rain was coming down so hard it felt aggressive. The kind of rain that doesn't just fall, but slams into the windshield. The radar on my phone lit up deep red right over our area. Anyone who's spent time watching weather maps knows what that color means. Severe rainfall, potential hail, dangerous conditions. The wind picked up almost immediately. I was strong enough that you could feel it pushing against the truck, nudging us sideways in our lane. The rain wasn't just loud, it stung. You could feel it through the glass, hear it hammering the metal roof, the sound drowning out conversation completely. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The windshield wipers were going as fast as they could, but they barely made a difference. Rain hit the glass faster than the blades could clear it, smearing the view instead of improving it. The road ahead blurred into a gray mess, headlights and taillights stretching into distorted streaks. We had to pick up our speed. Not because we wanted to, but because slowing down felt just as dangerous. Other drivers were struggling too. You could see cars drifting slightly, overcorrecting, braking too hard, then accelerating again. No one had full control. Everyone was just trying to stay upright and pointed forward. The road started flooding. Water pooled in low spots, creeping higher by the minute. You couldn't always tell how deep it was. One moment the pavement looked dark. The next your tires would hit water and the truck would feel light, like it wanted to slide instead of grip. Every second felt tense. I remember gripping the seat and bracing without realizing it. My brother was focused, jaw tight, hands steady on the wheel, but I could tell he was just as uneasy. The truck would sway when a gust hit it just right, and for a split second, it felt like we might lose it. Being 30 miles from home didn't help. There was no quick escape, no nearby shelter, no easy place to pull off safely. Just road, rain, wind, and water stretching out ahead of us. The idea of hydroplaning, of sliding sideways, of drifting off the road into something unseen, sat in the back of my mind the entire time. My dad had suggested earlier that we stay a little longer before heading back. Just 5 more minutes. At the time, that had sounded harmless. 5 minutes doesn't feel like anything. But now, driving through that storm, I kept thinking about it. About how close we had come to delaying. About how quickly conditions had gone from manageable to dangerous. We pushed through, slowly, carefully, doing everything we could to stay aligned with the road. When we finally pulled into our driveway, the relief was immediate and overwhelming. The sound of the rain still roared, but being off the road felt like stepping out of danger and into safety in a single motion. We got inside, soaked, shaken, quiet. Not long after, my mom saw a report. Someone had crashed. They had lost control and rolled into a ditch just 5 minutes after we passed through that exact area. The road there had flooded badly, water about a foot deep. When their vehicle hit it at speed, the tires lost traction, the car slipped sideways, and the force of the water caught it just right, flipping it over. They survived. That's the part everyone focuses on when telling the story. They lived. No fatalities. No tragedy in the way people usually define it. But all I could think about was timing. 5 minutes. If we had stayed like my dad suggested, if we had lingered just a little longer, if we had been in that stretch of road when the water had risen just a bit more, it easily could have been us. That realization sat heavy in my chest. Not fear exactly, but something quieter and more sobering. The understanding that sometimes danger doesn't look dramatic or cinematic. Sometimes it looks like rain, like wind, like a road you've driven 100 times suddenly becoming hostile. Weather doesn't care how careful you are. It doesn't care how experienced you feel. It doesn't care that you're close to home or far from it. When conditions turn, they turn fast. And all you can do is react and hope you make the right choices at the right time. That day stuck with me because nothing actually went wrong for us. No crash, no injuries, no emergency responders. Just a report on the news and the chilling knowledge of how close it had been. I'm glad we didn't stay 5 more minutes. I'm glad we trusted that unease and decided to leave when we did. Because sometimes survival isn't about skill or bravery. Sometimes it's about timing, and sometimes you don't realize how thin that margin was until you're already safe, standing inside, listening to the rain, knowing someone else was just a few minutes behind you and paid the price you narrowly avoided. When I was a kid, maybe 4 or 5 years old, there were a lot of things I didn't pay attention to, and a few things I noticed with strange clarity. Most days blurred together back then. Time moved differently. Weeks felt endless, but years slipped by without me realizing it. Still, there are certain images that stayed fixed in my memory, small and ordinary moments that somehow refused to fade. One of those moments was seeing the sisters walk past my house. It wasn't something dramatic or unusual. They didn't stop. They didn't talk to me. They didn't look at the house or do anything that should have made them memorable. They simply walked by every weekday afternoon, heading home from school. I only knew they were sisters because they walked together, close enough that even a child could sense the bond. One slightly taller, and the other trailing just behind. Sometimes they talked to each other, sometimes they didn't. What made them stand out to me was their uniforms. They wore private school uniforms, neat and consistent. Dark skirts, light shirts, blazers when the weather was cooler. To my child's mind, uniforms meant importance. They meant structure, rules, and a world separate from mine. I didn't go to a private school. I didn't wear anything special when I went outside. I remember thinking they looked official, like they belonged to something bigger and more serious than the rest of the neighborhood. They lived down the street, far enough that I didn't know them personally, but close enough that their daily routine passed directly through my world. My house sat in just the right place. If I was in the front room or playing near the window or sitting on the steps outside, I would see them pass. It became part of the rhythm of the day. Afternoon meant the sisters would walk by. Sometimes I waved. I don't remember if they ever waved back. Sometimes I just watched them go, my attention drifting back to toys or cartoons as soon as they disappeared from view. To me, they were just another background detail of childhood, like the sound of a neighbor's car or the way the light looked at a certain time of day. Nothing about them felt threatening. Nothing about them felt strange. They were just there. As I got older, I stopped noticing them. Or maybe they stopped walking that route. Maybe they started taking a different path home. Maybe their schedules changed. Childhood habits fade quietly, replaced by new routines and distractions. Eventually, I didn't think about them at all. Years passed. I grew up. I moved through school, through friendships, through all the awkward stages that slowly separate you from the child you used to be. My childhood home became just a place I lived, not the center of my entire universe. The street felt smaller, familiar, safe in that unexamined way you only realize later. Then, about 10 years after those afternoons by the window, I heard the news. It didn't come from a dramatic announcement or a headline shoved in my face. It came casually, the way terrible things often do. Someone mentioned it in conversation. A name came up, a location, a pause. The tone shifted just enough for me to know something was wrong. One of the sisters had been murdered. Not by a stranger, not by someone breaking in from outside. She was killed by her brother in their own kitchen, during what people described as some kind of psychotic break. The details were scarce and fragmented, passed along secondhand, but the core of it was clear enough to make my stomach drop. She died in the place where families eat together. She died in the place that's supposed to be safe. The realization hit me slowly, in layers. At first, it was just shock. The idea that someone so young had been killed at all. Then confusion, trying to reconcile the image in my mind of the girl in a neat uniform walking calmly down the street with the violence of what I was hearing. And then recognition. I knew her. Not really, not in any meaningful way. We'd never spoken. We'd never shared a space or a conversation. But I had seen her, repeatedly. She had walked past my house so many times that her presence had become part of my childhood landscape. That connection made the story feel different. It wasn't a distant tragedy anymore. It wasn't something that happened to someone abstract, someone defined only by a news article or a rumor. It happened to someone who had once existed in my line of sight, someone whose shoes had touched the same pavement I played on, someone who had moved through the same quiet neighborhood I associated with safety and familiarity. I started thinking about the house they lived in. I had passed it countless times without noticing anything unusual. Just another house, another driveway, another front door. If you'd asked me to point it out, I probably couldn't have. It blended in perfectly the way most homes do. Nothing about it would have made you pause and think something terrible could happen inside. That's what unsettled me the most. There were no warning signs that would have made sense to a child. No obvious danger. No sense that behind one of those doors, something fragile and unstable was quietly building toward a breaking point. I thought about the brother. I didn't know him either, not even by sight. I didn't remember seeing a boy walking with the sisters. Maybe he was older. Maybe younger. Maybe he took a different route. Maybe he stayed inside. Whatever the reason, he existed outside my memory, until suddenly he existed as the person who ended his sister's life. People use the phrase psychotic break, but that phrase doesn't explain much. It labels something without making it understandable. It doesn't tell you what the house felt like before that moment or what signs, if any, were missed. It doesn't tell you how long the struggle had been happening quietly, or how sudden it truly was. It just tells you that something snapped. I found myself replaying those childhood images in my head. The sisters walking together, the sound of their shoes on the sidewalk, the way they kept pace with each other. I wondered what their home life had been like then. Were there arguments behind closed doors, tension, fear, or was everything normal, at least on the surface? As a kid, I assumed that houses were what they looked like from the outside. If a house looked clean and ordinary, then the people inside were fine. If kids walked to school in uniforms, then they were safe, structured, protected. That's how a child's logic works. You don't imagine violence unless you've been taught to. Learning what happened forced me to confront how wrong that assumption was. The kitchen where she died was probably a place where meals had been cooked for years. A place where homework might have been done at the table. A place where laughter had happened at some point. Because it almost always does. And yet, that same space became the setting for something horrific. The proximity of it all is what still gets to me. Not just the emotional closeness, but the physical closeness. The fact that while I was sleeping in my childhood bedroom, while I was playing with toys or watching TV, while I was growing up with the comfortable belief that my neighborhood was uneventful and safe, something so dark was quietly possible, just down the street. It makes you rethink the idea of distance. We tend to believe that violence belongs elsewhere, in other cities, in other neighborhoods, in places we don't recognize. It's a psychological buffer, a way to feel safe without constantly being afraid. We tell ourselves that terrible things happen far away to other people. But the truth is, they don't need to be far away. They can be close enough. that you remember the sound of someone's footsteps passing your house. That realization didn't make me paranoid, but it did make me more aware, more conscious of how little we truly know about the lives unfolding around us. How many quiet struggles exist behind closed doors. How many families look ordinary until the moment they aren't. I also thought about timing. If someone had told me, when I was 5 years old, that one of those girls would be dead in 10 years, I wouldn't have understood. I wouldn't have believed it. The future felt infinite back then. Adults felt permanent. Houses felt stable. Nothing seemed capable of changing so violently. Yet it did. And there was nothing dramatic about the lead-up that anyone outside the family could point to. No sirens that echoed through my childhood memory. No police lights that burned themselves into my mind. Just a later realization that a line had been crossed in a place I once considered unremarkable. Sometimes, when I think about my childhood home now, I see it differently. Not as a place of fear, but as a reminder. A reminder that safety is often something we assume, not something guaranteed. That proximity doesn't equal understanding. That you can grow up alongside the shadows of other people's lives without ever knowing they're there. I think about how easily that story could have been just another line in a news report to me. Just another tragedy among many. But because of those small, ordinary memories, it became personal in a way I didn't expect. It's scary not because it involved anything supernatural. It's scary because it didn't. It was real. It was human. It was rooted in a family, in mental illness, in circumstances that don't announce themselves clearly until it's too late. And it happened in a kitchen, not a dark alley or some distant, unknowable place. You really don't think something like that could happen so close, until you find out that it did. And once you know that, the world doesn't look quite as simple as it did when you were 5 years old, watching two sisters in school uniforms walk past your house, believing that ordinary things always stay ordinary. Sorry to pause for just a moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope you're enjoying the calm so far. If you'd like more nights like this, true stories, gentle rain, no interruptions, please subscribe to Lacuna Noir. It really helps me keep creating these peaceful experiences for you. And tap the bell so you're here every time a new story arrives in the dark. Now, back to the story. Whenever I went to my dad's house when I was around 13, there was a stretch of road we always passed that I never really thought about. It was just part of the route, one of those places you see over and over until it becomes invisible. Around the corner of a quiet neighborhood, there was a community garden, neat rows of plants, a small fence, people tending it sometimes. It felt ordinary, harmless, almost comforting in a way. Most of the time, my dad drove us from my mom's place to his, but one week his car was in the shop, so my mom was the one driving. We were passing the garden like always, and she casually mentioned that there used to be a house there. That caught my attention. I asked her what happened to it. She didn't pause or lower her voice. She didn't seem to think it was a big deal. She just told me, plainly, that an old man had lived there. He was in a wheelchair. One day, the house caught on fire, and he burned inside before he could get out. Paramedics couldn't save him. That was it. She said it the way people sometimes talk about sad facts they've already processed. No drama, no buildup, just information. Then she kept driving. At the time, I remember thinking, okay, that's awful. But my reaction was muted. I was 13. Death was still something distant to me, something that happened to old people or strangers. not something you sat with and truly imagined. I looked out the window at the garden and tried to picture a house there, but it didn't fully register. It wasn't until later that it hit me. Not all at once, but slowly, in pieces. I started thinking about what it actually meant. I was told later that it had been a two-story house. I don't know if that detail is perfectly accurate, but even the idea of it is enough. A two-story house, an old man, a wheelchair, a fire. Once you really let yourself imagine it, it becomes unbearable. Picture being in your late 60s or 70s. Your body already doesn't move the way it used to. Every motion takes effort. Pain is part of daily life. You rely on routines, on familiarity, on knowing exactly where things are because sudden change is hard. Your house isn't just a place you live, it's your safe space. It's where everything you need is set up to accommodate you. Then, without warning, it starts to burn. At first, maybe it's just the smell. Smoke creeping through the air, sharp and wrong. Your brain probably tries to rationalize it. Something on the stove. An electrical issue, you don't immediately think, this is it. You don't immediately think you're about to die. Then the heat starts building. Heat in a fire isn't like heat on a summer day. It's aggressive. It presses in on you. It steals your breath. The air becomes thick, heavy, hard to pull into your lungs. Every inhale burns. Panic starts to rise, but your body doesn't respond the way it would if you were young and able-bodied. You're in a wheelchair. You have to maneuver out of whatever room you're in. You can't just stand up and run. You can't drop to the floor easily. You can't crawl if the smoke gets low. You have to roll, and every second matters. If the house is 2 stories, the problem gets worse. You need to get to the staircase. You need to get to the lift if there is one. You need that lift to work. You need electricity. You need time. Fires don't give you time. The smoke spreads fast. It fills rooms. It eats oxygen. Your eyes burn. Tears stream down your face, not from emotion, but from pain and instinct. Your lungs start to scream before your mouth does. Imagine trying to stay calm enough to control a wheelchair while your survival instincts are screaming at you to move faster than your body allows. Imagine reaching the staircase and realizing you're still too far, or the lift isn't responding, or the power has already gone out. Imagine knowing, in a quiet but unmistakable way, that help isn't coming fast enough. That's the part that gets me. Not just the fire, but the awareness. The moment where you understand that you are trapped. People talk about fear as something loud and chaotic, but sometimes it's crushingly clear. Sometimes it's the sudden, horrible certainty that there is no solution left, that your options are gone. Your skin begins to burn, not all at once, but in spots. A sleeve catches. Heat licks at exposed skin. Pain registers in sharp flashes that your brain can barely process because there's too much happening at once. You want to stop, drop, and roll because that's what you've been taught since you were a kid. But you can't. Your body doesn't allow it. The rules you learned for survival don't apply to you in the same way. Every scream you make tears at your throat, not just from terror, but from smoke, from heat, from the raw strain of trying to breathe. Your voice sounds wrong to your own ears, animal. Broken, nothing like the voice you recognize as yours. And the smell. People don't like to talk about smell when it comes to death, but smell is powerful. It's invasive. It sticks in your mind. The idea of being aware of your own body burning, of that smell being yours, is something my brain struggles to accept without recoiling. Your world becomes pain, heat, panic, and the desperate urge to escape a body and a situation you can't escape. There is no dignity in that kind of death. No peace, no gentle fading, just raw terror until consciousness finally gives out. When I allowed myself to really think about it, it almost sent me into a mild panic attack. My chest tightened. My breathing became shallow. I had to consciously slow myself down and remind myself that I was safe, that I wasn't there, that this had already happened, that I was just imagining it. Even now, writing this, I can feel that same unease creeping in. My body reacts before my mind does. Shan, what makes it so frightening isn't that it's some rare supernatural horror. It's that it's entirely possible. It's that it already happened. It's that someone lived through that exact scenario in a place I passed regularly without a second thought. The community garden looks peaceful, green, alive. People plant vegetables there. Kids walk by. Nothing about it suggests what happened on that ground before. The fire didn't leave a visible scar. The house is gone. The evidence erased. Life moved on. But someone died there in one of the worst ways imaginable. That contrast messes with me. We tend to think of danger as something loud and obvious, something that announces itself. Fires, especially house fires, are often talked about in terms of property damage, insurance, rebuilding. The human experience inside them is glossed over or reduced to statistics. But when you stop and actually imagine being the person inside, especially someone with limited mobility, it becomes deeply disturbing. It also forces you to confront something uncomfortable about aging and vulnerability. As a kid or teenager, you rarely think about what it will feel like to lose independence, to need help moving, to rely on technology or accommodations just to exist comfortably. The idea that something as random as a fire could turn those limitations into a death sentence is terrifying in a way that doesn't fade easily. It made me think about my own grandparents, about people I love, about how many homes are not designed with true emergencies in mind, especially for those who can't move quickly or easily. It also made me realize how close horror can be to normal life. This didn't happen in a war zone. It didn't happen in some distant, infamous place. It happened in a quiet neighborhood, on a street people still drive down, where a garden now grows. I think that's why it unsettled me so much. You never think something like that could happen somewhere so familiar, somewhere tied to routine, to childhood memories, to ordinary days. You assume safety because you need to. Because imagining all the ways things could go wrong would make it impossible to function. But sometimes a single piece of information cracks that illusion. After my mom told me that story, I never looked at that garden the same way again. Every time I passed it, I couldn't help but picture the house that used to be there, the man inside it. The final moments no one could stop. It's not scary in a fun way. It's not the kind of story you tell around a campfire to get a thrill. It's scary in a quiet, existential way. The kind of fear that comes from realizing how fragile life really is, and how little control we sometimes have, especially as our bodies fail us. Even now, thinking about it makes my stomach twist. Not because I believe it will happen to me tomorrow, but because I know it could happen to someone, somewhere, right now. And because imagining it, even briefly, is enough to make your body revolt against the thought. Sometimes, the most terrifying stories don't involve monsters or ghosts at all. They involve ordinary places, ordinary people, and a single moment where everything goes wrong and there is no escape. And once you truly think about that, it's hard to unthink it. My mom told me this story a while ago, and even now, every time I think about it, it sits somewhere between terrifying and surreal. I should say up front that some details might be off. This didn't happen to me. It happened to her when she was a kid, and it's something she remembers in pieces, the way people remember moments that scared them before they fully understood fear. She grew up spending a lot of time at her grandmother's house. It was one of those old family homes that had been lived in for generations. The kind of place where rooms felt bigger than they should, ceilings were higher than modern houses, and everything carried the quiet weight of age. Nothing about it was obviously creepy during the day. It was just old, full of furniture that had been there forever. Objects no one really used anymore, but no one wanted to throw away either. Like a lot of kids, my mom and her friends loved exploring places they weren't supposed to. Doors marked, "Don't go in," rooms adults rarely entered, storage spaces filled with forgotten things. The attic was the biggest attraction. It sat at the top of the house, reached by a narrow staircase that creaked loudly with every step. It wasn't a finished attic. There was no insulation covering the beams, no proper flooring in some areas, just wooden planks, dust, and the smell of old fabric and dry air. To kids, it felt like a secret world. One afternoon, my mom and a few of her friends decided to go up there to play. There were no adults watching them closely. They climbed the stairs, laughing and daring each other to go first. I pretending to be brave while secretly hoping someone else would take the lead. Sunlight filtered in through a small window, catching dust particles in the air and making everything glow softly. That's when they found the desk. It wasn't something they remembered seeing before, or at least not something they had paid attention to. It sat off to one side of the attic, partially covered by old sheets and boxes. When they pulled the sheets away, they saw that it was an old wooden desk with a large mirror attached to it. The mirror was tall, almost as tall as a child, framed in dark wood that looked worn smooth by time. The desk itself had drawers built into it. Naturally, they opened them. Inside were pieces of jewelry. Not shiny, modern jewelry, but older pieces. Necklaces with dull metal chains. Rings that were a little too big. Bracelets that looked like they belonged to another era. To a group of kids, it was treasure. Something magical and forbidden at the same time. They started trying things on. One girl put on a necklace and admired herself in the mirror. Another slipped a ring onto her finger and joked about being rich. My mom remembers laughing, the kind of carefree laughter kids have when they feel safe and bored at the same time. They talked over each other, making up stories about who the jewelry might have belonged to, imagining fancy parties and secret lives. Then everything changed. Out of nowhere, someone started screaming. Not a quick yell, not laughter, not a startled noise. It was screaming. Full-on, panicked screaming. The kind that makes your stomach drop before your brain has time to process what's happening. All of them froze. They looked at each other, wide-eyed, confused. None of them were screaming. No one's mouth was open. No one was joking. The sound was real, loud, and coming from somewhere in the attic. For a split second, my mom thought maybe someone had fallen or gotten hurt. She scanned her friends' faces, trying to figure out who needed help. But everyone looked just as terrified as she felt. Then one of her friends screamed too. Not in the same way as the first scream, but in pure shock. She shouted something like, "Oh my God," and bolted toward the stairs without waiting for anyone else. Her reaction was so sudden and so desperate that it snapped the rest of them out of their confusion. My mom turned toward the mirror. She didn't know why she did. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was because the mirror had been the focus of their play. Maybe some part of her sensed that whatever was happening was connected to it. When she looked up, she saw a face staring back at them. It wasn't any of their faces. It was a clown. Not a cartoon clown. not something playful or exaggerated. It was a face that looked wrong in a way that's hard to describe. The features were stretched into a wide smile that didn't feel friendly. The eyes looked fixed, unblinking, and far too aware. The expression didn't change. It didn't move closer. It didn't lunge or make a sound. It just smiled. That was enough. My mom didn't scream. She didn't stop to question it. She didn't think about whether it made sense. She ran. All of them ran. They shoved past each other, nearly tripping down the narrow stairs, hearts pounding, breath coming in sharp gasps. They didn't look back. They didn't slow down until they were far away from the attic, back in the parts of the house that felt normal and safe. They never went back up there. Not that day, not any other day. The attic became off limits without anyone needing to say it out loud. If someone mentioned it, the conversation died quickly. No one wanted to admit how scared they had been. No one wanted to talk about what they had seen or thought they had seen. Years later, my mom still isn't sure how to explain it. She's not someone who believes easily in supernatural things. She's practical, grounded, and not prone to exaggeration. When she tells the story, she doesn't embellish it. She doesn't claim she knows exactly what it was. She just describes what she remembers plainly, without trying to convince anyone of anything. Oh, sometimes she wonders if it was a trick of the light. Shadows and reflections combining in a way that terrified a group of already excited kids. Old mirrors can distort images, especially in dim lighting, dust, movement, imagination. All of those are possible explanations. But then there's the screaming. That's the part she can't reconcile easily. The fact that all of them heard it. The fact that it happened before anyone reacted. The fact that it didn't belong to any of them. The timing of it, paired with the image in the mirror, made the experience feel shared in a way dreams and imagination usually aren't. When she told me this story, she didn't do it in a dark, dramatic setting. It wasn't whispered late at night. It came up casually, the way family stories sometimes do, folded into a normal conversation. She laughed at parts of it, shaking her head at how kids can scare themselves. I listened, half terrified and half amused. When she finished, I looked at her and said jokingly, "Yeah, fuck that shit." She laughed, a real easy laugh, the kind that tells you she's okay, that whatever happened back then didn't haunt her every day or turn her into someone afraid of mirrors or attics. She moved on with her life. She grew up. She became a mom. She became the kind of person who can tell a creepy story and then immediately go back to talking about dinner plans or errands. That's one of the things I love most about her. She doesn't let fear own her. Still, sometimes I think about that attic, about a group of kids playing with jewelry that didn't belong to them, about a mirror reflecting something it shouldn't have, about a scream that came from nowhere and made all of them run without fully understanding why. I don't know if what they saw was real. I don't know if it was imagination, coincidence, or something stranger. I don't know if there was ever a clown at all, or if that image was the mind's way of making sense of something it couldn't process. But I do know this. Whatever it was enough to send a group of fearless kids running and keep them out of that attic forever. And even if the explanation is simple, even if it was just fear feeding on itself, there's something unsettling about moments like that. Moments where everyone present agrees something was wrong, even if no one can say exactly what. My mom went on with her life like it was nothing more than a creepy childhood memory. I joked about it and laughed with her, and the day continued like normal. But every now and then, when I see an old mirror in a place that feels forgotten, I remember her story. And I think to myself, quietly, and sincerely, yeah, fuck that shit. That happened while I was on vacation in Outer Banks. And even now, it's one of those memories that still feels heavy when I think about it. Not dramatic in the way horror movies are, but unsettling in a very real, very human way. It was 2015. We were staying in a beach house, doing what people always do on vacation. Waking up late, getting ready slowly, planning when to head down to the water. Nothing about that morning felt strange or ominous. I was getting ready to go to the beach when suddenly everything outside shifted. 5 police and surf rescue trucks went flying past, followed by 2 ambulances, lights and sirens tearing through the neighborhood. It was fast, loud, urgent. The kind of response that makes your stomach tighten even before you know why. At the time, my mind jumped to sharks. That summer, there had been a lot of shark attacks in the area, and everyone was already on edge about it. I immediately assumed that's what this was. Even so, I still went down to the beach. I don't know why. Maybe curiosity, maybe denial, maybe because when you're on vacation, your brain wants things to stay normal. Whatever the reason, I walked down like I had planned to, expecting maybe to see some commotion farther down the shore, not realizing how close it actually was. When I got there, I saw paramedics doing CPR on a man. Not in the distance, not behind some kind of barrier, right there on the sand. His body was laid out. People crowded around him, hands pressing rhythmically on his chest, movements urgent and practiced. There was no drama, no shouting, just focused, intense effort and the sound of waves behind it, which somehow made it worse. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes. That's it. 5 minutes was all I could handle before my body decided for me that I needed to leave. I felt shaky, disconnected, like I shouldn't be witnessing something that personal. I turned around and walked back to the beach house, my heart racing, my head spinning. By the time I got back, another ambulance went screaming down toward the beach, sirens blaring again. That's when it really hit me that this wasn't going to end well. I went inside and stayed there. I didn't go back out. I didn't sit on the deck. I didn't walk around the neighborhood. I just stayed inside, trying to distract myself, but everything felt off. The sound of the sirens kept replaying in my head. The image of the paramedics working on him wouldn't go away. A few hours later, my dad came back from talking to someone he knew. My dad had a friend who owned a house in the same neighborhood we were staying in. He had gone down to talk to him and see what had happened. When he came back, he told us the rest. The man I had seen on the beach was pronounced dead there. They couldn't save him. The second ambulance, the one that came later, wasn't for him at all. It was for his wife. She had been on the beach too. After watching everything unfold, she had a severe anxiety or panic attack and nearly stopped breathing herself. They had to take her away as well. Hearing that made my stomach drop in a completely different way. It wasn't just that someone had died. It was that his wife had watched it happen, that she had been standing there while people tried and failed to bring him back, that she had lost him in a place that was supposed to be joyful, relaxing, safe. He and I had been there too. Not close enough to know him, not involved in any way, but close enough to see the attempt, close enough to feel the reality of it settle in my chest. It made the whole beach feel wrong after that, like the atmosphere had changed permanently, even though nothing looked different. We didn't go back to the beach for the remaining 6 days of the trip. Not once. It wasn't a conscious decision at first. No one said, "We're not going back." It just didn't happen. Every time we thought about it, there was a heaviness that came with the idea. The beach no longer felt like a place to relax. It felt like a place where something final had happened. People were still out there, of course. Families, kids, umbrellas, laughter. Life went on like it always does. But for us, it felt wrong to sit on that sand and pretend nothing had happened, knowing what we knew. What stuck with me the most wasn't the chaos or the sirens. It was how fast everything changed. One moment, I was getting ready for a normal beach day. The next, I was watching someone die. Not in a hospital, not behind closed doors, but out in the open, under the sun, with the ocean rolling in behind him like it always had. It made me realize how thin the line is between ordinary and devastating. Vacation doesn't protect you from reality. Beautiful places don't. The ocean doesn't care why you're there or how relaxed you're supposed to be. Life and death don't pause just because people are on holiday. Even now, when I think about that trip, that's what I remember first. Not the weather, not the house, not the good moments. I remember the sirens, the CPR, the second ambulance, and the knowledge that someone's entire life ended in front of a crowd of strangers who never expected to see something like that. It wasn't paranormal. It wasn't mysterious. It was just real. And sometimes, that's the creepiest thing of all. Back in April, something happened that still doesn't feel real when I think about it. It's not a story I tell lightly, because even now my body reacts before my mind does. My chest tightens, my hands feel cold, and for a second, I'm right back there, suspended between impact and survival. Me and my closest friend had planned to go on a hike that day. Nothing intense, just getting outside, clearing our heads, doing something normal. The kind of plan you don't overthink. We drove out early, talking about random stuff, already picturing the trail and the quiet that comes with being away from people. When we got to the start of the trail, there was a sign posted up front saying it was closed. That should have been the end of it, but we were young, stubborn, and convinced rules were flexible. We looked at each other, shrugged, and decided to try anyway. It didn't feel dangerous. It felt like bending a rule that probably didn't matter. We hadn't even gotten that far when a forest ranger stopped us. She was firm but calm and told us we needed to turn back immediately. So we did. No arguing, no pushing it. We got back in the truck and headed out. The adrenaline hadn't fully worn off yet, and that's important. We were still in that careless, wired headspace, laughing it off, talking fast, driving faster than we should have been. We were heading back down the road when we took a corner too hard. There was no dramatic buildup, no warning. 1 second we were turning. The next, the truck lost traction completely. I remember the feeling of weightlessness before my brain could even register what was happening. The world tilted violently, and then we were gone. We went straight off a cliff. Later, we were told it was over 90 feet. At the time, it felt endless. The truck rolled. Once, then again. Everything inside became noise and force and chaos. Metal screaming, glass breaking. My body being thrown in directions it wasn't meant to go. Then there was the water. We hit the lake at the bottom. Cold. Shockingly cold. The kind of cold that punches the air out of your lungs. The truck started sinking immediately. Water rushed in, fast and unforgiving. There was no time to think, only react. I came up almost instantly. I don't know how. I don't remember unbuckling. I don't remember making decisions. I just know that my fight or flight response took over completely. There was no panic, no hesitation, just one overwhelming thought: get out. The window on my side was down. That's the only reason I'm here. I swam out through it, water burning my lungs, and pushed myself toward the surface. When I broke through the water, I sucked in air like I'd never breathed before and swam as hard as I could toward the shore. My muscles didn't feel pain yet. Adrenaline had taken over everything. When I reached land, I turned around and saw my friend. He had managed to get out too and was on top of the truck as it continued to sink. I yelled for him, waved, did anything I could to let him know I was there. He made his way off, and I helped pull him to shore. We were both shaking, soaked, bleeding in places we didn't even notice yet, but alive. The next problem was getting out. The cliff we'd gone over was massive, steep, rocky, and unforgiving. Somehow I managed to climb it. I don't remember how my body did that after what it had just been through. I just know that I did it. When survival mode is on, your body finds strength you didn't know existed. At the top, reality started setting in. We had no service. My phone was gone, left underwater in the truck. There was no way to call for help. No way to explain what had just happened. We were injured in shock and standing on the edge of a road where no one was guaranteed to pass by. That's when something happened that still feels unreal. A truck came around the bend, out of nowhere. Perfect timing. If it had come minutes earlier, it might have gone over with us. Minutes later, and we might have been stranded for hours. We flagged them down, probably looking like something out of a nightmare, and they got us help. Emergency services came. We were checked over. Somehow, unbelievably, we hadn't been hurt too badly physically. Bruises, cuts, strains. Nothing that explained how close we had come to dying. But the damage didn't stop at the surface. We both have pretty bad PTSD now. Loud noises, sudden movements, certain roads, even the sound of rushing water can trigger it. Sleep isn't always easy. Sometimes the memory hits without warning, and it feels like falling all over again. We're working through it, slowly, day by day. It's getting better, but it's not something you just shake off. What stays with me the most isn't the fear. It's how fast everything happened. One bad decision stacked on top of another, ignoring a sign, driving too fast, one hard turn, and suddenly, our lives were balanced on whether a window happened to be down and whether another driver happened to come by at exactly the right moment. People talk about miracles like they're big, glowing moments. Sometimes they're just timing. Sometimes they're just a truck coming around a bend when it shouldn't have, but did. We're alive. We're healing. And every day after that feels borrowed in a way I didn't understand before. I worked in the kitchen at a summer camp all through high school and into my first 2 years of college. It was one of those jobs you stick with because it's familiar, seasonal, and easy to return to year after year. The pay wasn't great, but the environment was relaxed, and after a while the camp started to feel like its own small world, separate from everything else. During my senior year of high school, my cousin worked there too. He was on the maintenance crew. He was 3 years older than me, and at the time I really looked up to him. In my mind, he was one of those guys who had things figured out. He was confident, social, and seemed comfortable with who he was. Looking back now, it's a little ironic that I thought that way, considering he was a 20-year-old cleaning toilets at a summer camp. But when you're younger, perspective is different. One night after work, my cousin and 4 female staff members decided they wanted to drive into town to get ice cream. The town was about 5 miles away, down a narrow stretch of winding mountain roads. These weren't highways. They were twisty, uneven, tree-lined roads that didn't forgive mistakes, especially at night. They asked if I wanted to go along, and of course I said yes. The plan was already ridiculous. The car was a Corolla, and there were already too many people in it. I was fully prepared to squeeze into the back seat and basically lie across the laps of 3 women, despite the fact that I'm 6'4". It was uncomfortable, impractical, and unsafe. But at that age, none of that mattered. It felt like part of the fun. Then my buddy Lam asked if he could come. Lam was Vietnamese, which is why the name always made people pause, and he was a good friend of mine. Once he asked to join, reality set in. There was absolutely no room left in the Corolla. No amount of squeezing or poor judgment was going to make it work. So Lam and I decided to take my car instead. I drove a Subaru Legacy wagon. Even at the time, I knew it wasn't exactly impressive, but it was reliable and had room. We joked about it being a chick magnet, fully aware of how untrue that was. Still, it solved the problem, and we all headed out together. My cousin took the lead in his car, and Lam and I followed behind as we left the camp and started down the mountain. The road dropped quickly, winding back and forth through trees with no streetlights and very little room for error. The pavement was wet that night, either from recent rain or lingering moisture in the air. My cousin was driving fast. He would later insist he wasn't speeding, and maybe technically he wasn't, but he was definitely pushing it. We were keeping pace behind him, following his tail lights through the curves, the road feeling tighter and darker with each turn. Then it happened. There was a hard right turn, sharper than the ones before it. As his car entered the turn, it lost traction. We saw the taillights jerk sideways as the car fishtailed. In seconds, everything went wrong. The Corolla slid, clipped a tree on the side of the road, and then rolled, ending up upside down in a ditch on the wrong side of the road. It happened fast, but it didn't feel fast while watching it. Lam and I slammed on the brakes and jumped out of the car immediately. The night was suddenly quiet except for the sound of dripping water and the engine ticking as it cooled. The car was completely wrecked, resting on its roof, glass shattered, body twisted. All I could think about was whether everyone inside was alive. We ran over and started helping people out of the car. One by one, they crawled free. Miraculously, everyone was okay. There were cuts, bruises, and a lot of shaking hands, but no one was seriously injured. No broken bones, no one unconscious. It felt unreal, like the outcome didn't match what we'd just seen. The car, however, was totaled. Once everyone was standing on the side of the road and the adrenaline started to fade, another thought hit me hard. I kept replaying the night in my head and realizing how close I had come to being in that car. If Lam hadn't asked to come, I would have been lying across the back seat with no seatbelt on, half stretched across people's laps. I don't like to think about what that would have meant. The difference between being shaken on the side of the road and being severely injured or worse came down to something as small as one extra person wanting ice cream. To make things even more absurd, the accident happened in a state forest. When everything was said and done, my cousin ended up getting fined by the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. Not just for the crash, but specifically for damaging the tree he hit while the car was rolling over. No one was seriously hurt. The car was destroyed, and on top of that, he had to pay for the tree. We eventually made it back to camp, quiet and exhausted, the night ending nothing like we'd planned. The ice cream never happened. What stuck with me instead was the realization of how easily things could have gone differently. I still think about it sometimes, about how confident I was, how careless we all were, and how a decision that felt trivial at the time almost put me in the worst possible place at the worst possible moment. It wasn't a dramatic lesson. No speeches, No life-changing epiphany, right then and there. Just the slow understanding, years later, that sometimes survival isn't about skill or intelligence. Sometimes it's about chance, about who gets in which car, about one small decision that quietly changes everything. This happened to me a few years ago, but it still feels close, like something that never fully settled into the past. It's one of those experiences that doesn't fade or turn into a funny story over time. Instead, it stays sharp, coming back in flashes, especially at night or whenever I'm near trees and there's a little too much quiet. Where I live, the forest starts almost immediately after the edge of the city. You can walk 10 minutes from streetlights and apartment buildings, and suddenly you're surrounded by trees. It's not some deep, remote wilderness, but it's dense enough that once you're inside, the world changes quickly. Sounds behave differently. Light disappears fast. Paths that feel obvious during the day become vague and uncertain after dark. My friend and I used to love taking nighttime forest walks. We were young, restless, and a little too comfortable with our surroundings. We'd grown up near those woods, walked them hundreds of times, and felt like we understood them. We knew there were wild boars and other animals around, which was exactly why we stayed quiet. You don't want to announce yourself in a place like that. Silence felt like common sense, like respect. That night, it was already almost pitch black when we went in. There was no moon to speak of, and the canopy swallowed what little light there was. The path was barely visible, more a suggestion than a road. We walked slowly, listening, placing our feet carefully. Our conversation had faded into silence, partly because of the animals, partly because the dark naturally made you more inward. Then we heard the drums. At first, it didn't hit us as something alarming. It was rhythmic, steady, unchanging. Not chaotic, not sudden, just a constant beat, repeating over and over. The sound carried strangely through the trees, echoing just enough to make it hard to tell where it was coming from. Our first thought was simple. Someone was having a party, a sleepover, a campfire gathering. That forest was popular with young people, especially in warmer months. People went there to drink, make fires, roast food, mess around. Drums weren't that far-fetched. Someone might have brought them for atmosphere or fun. That explanation should have been enough. But something didn't sit right. As we kept walking, we realized we couldn't see any light at all. No campfire glow, no flashlights, no phone screens, nothing. The forest ahead and around us was completely dark. If people were gathered nearby, there should have been at least some flicker of light, some movement, something breaking the blackness. The drumming didn't change. Same rhythm, same tempo, no variation. We started walking faster, more alert now, scanning the darkness ahead, to the sides behind us. Our eyes strained, trying to make sense of shadows that all looked the same. The road beneath our feet was barely visible, just a slightly lighter patch of ground. Then the realization hit us both at almost the same time. The sound was getting louder, not gradually fading as if we were moving toward it, but closing in, like it was following us, like the distance between us and the source was shrinking no matter which way we went. That was when fear kicked in. Not the slow unease from before, but sharp, electric panic. Our breathing picked up. Our steps became uneven. We started talking, fast and overlapping, voices low but frantic. What the hell is that? This doesn't make sense. Why is it closer? What the fuck is this? The drumming was no longer somewhere in the forest. It was behind us, close enough that we could feel it more than hear it. vibrating through the ground and air. It sounded like it was 5 meters away, maybe less. We didn't wait to confirm it. We ran. Not a controlled jog, not cautious movement, but full, reckless sprinting. Branches slapped at us. Leaves and sticks crunched loudly under our feet. Any thought of wild animals vanished. At that point, being quiet didn't matter anymore. Survival did. The sound stayed with us as we ran. It didn't lag behind. It didn't fade. It felt like it was keeping pace, always just out of sight. Neither of us dared to turn around. We both knew, without saying it, that looking back would make it worse. When we finally broke out of the forest and reached the edge where the city began, the sound stopped. Not slowly, not gradually. It just wasn't there anymore. Streetlights came into view. Pavement replaced dirt. The world snapped back into something recognizable and human. We didn't slow down until we were far enough away that our lungs burned and our legs shook. We never went back after dark. Even now, years later, we talk about that night. We've gone over it again and again, trying to explain it away. Sound traveling strangely. Echoes, coincidence, adrenaline amplifying something mundane. But every time, we come back to the same conclusion. It wasn't our imagination. We both heard the same thing. We both felt the same shift. We both experienced the same impossible closeness of that sound. And the way it stopped the moment we left the forest is something neither of us has ever been able to rationalize. There was another strange experience in that forest, though it didn't carry the same fear. It was winter, daylight. Everything was covered in about 10 centimeters of snow. The world felt muted and clean, the way it does after a heavy snowfall. We were next to a campfire spot, one we'd used before. The fire pit itself was buried under snow. It was freezing, but the sun was out and the forest felt calm. Then we saw smoke. At first, we thought it was our breath catching the light, but it wasn't. It was real smoke, thin and gray, rising from the snow. A few seconds later, a small fire appeared, melting the snow away, as if something underneath had been smoldering, waiting. It wasn't scary, just strange, interesting in a way that made you stop and stare. There was no obvious explanation, no visible source. It didn't feel threatening, just wrong in a quieter, more curious way. Those two experiences alone would have been enough to make the forest feel different forever. But there's something else that has always stuck with me. Something entirely separate, but just as unsettling. Years ago, there was a school shooting carried out by Kip Kinkle. The details are horrific, and I won't dwell on the violence itself. What haunts me most isn't just what he did, but the moments right before it happened. The most disturbing part is that the vice principal, who knew him and was aware he had been expelled, saw him walk past the front office just minutes before the shooting began. Kip waved at him, a casual gesture, almost friendly. The vice principal was on the phone at the time. He noticed Kip and made a decision that, in hindsight, feels unbearable. He chose to finish the call first, planning to confront him afterward and tell him he wasn't allowed on school grounds. That confrontation never happened. Now, before the phone call ended, Kip had already started shooting in the cafeteria. There were kids who survived only because they did something unthinkable. Some who had been shot lay on top of uninjured students, trying to shield them, hoping that if Kip came back through, he would see bodies and assume everyone there was already dead. The school changed after that. More security, more barriers, more rules. All the things that come after tragedy. When people try to rebuild a sense of control that was shattered in minutes. What makes it even stranger for me is how close this all feels, even though I wasn't there. My high school English teacher had met him. She had been one of his mother's students. These aren't distant, abstract connections. They're human threads that make the story harder to push away, harder to compartmentalize as something that happened somewhere else to someone else. It's just crazy to think about how small decisions and timing shape everything. A phone call finished instead of interrupted. A wave in a hallway. A few minutes that separate normalcy from catastrophe. There's something deeply unsettling about realizing how thin that line is. How the world can be completely ordinary one moment, full of routine and small annoyances, and then irreversibly broken the next. Whether it's drums in a dark forest that shouldn't be there, a fire igniting under snow, or a familiar face walking through a school minutes before violence erupts, the common thread is the same. The warning signs aren't always loud. Sometimes they're subtle. Sometimes they feel almost mundane. Sometimes they don't feel like fear at all, just confusion or discomfort or a vague sense that something is off. And by the time you realize what they meant, it's already too late. That's what stays with me. Not just the fear, but the uncertainty, the unanswered questions, the knowledge that there are moments in life where everything hinges on instinct, timing, or pure chance. And that sometimes the only reason you're able to tell the story afterward is because somehow you were just far enough away when it happened. This happened a few years ago, but it's one of those moments that never really leaves you. Not because something terrible happened, but because something almost did. The kind of experience that replays itself in your mind late at night, where every small decision feels heavier the more you think about it. It was a normal night, at least it started that way. I had just finished playing at an open mic. Nothing big, nothing dramatic. Just a local spot, a handful of people, some music, the usual mix of nerves and relief that comes with getting on stage and then finally being done. I had my guitar strapped to my back, my head still buzzing a little from the night, already thinking about getting home and sleeping. My hometown isn't huge, but it's not tiny either. The kind of place where you recognize streets and buildings more than individual people. Downtown has a few bars, a couple restaurants, and stretches that get quiet quickly once the night moves on. I was walking alone like I'd done plenty of times before. Not really on edge, not really relaxed either. Just moving through familiar territory on autopilot. As I passed a restaurant, I noticed a few guys standing out front. They didn't look like they were waiting for a table or having a casual conversation. They were clustered together, leaning in close, talking low. The kind of body language that makes you register them without fully understanding why. Nothing illegal, nothing obvious, just off. I kept walking. One of them stood out immediately. He was big, not just tall, but wide, broad shoulders, thick neck, a shaved head that caught what little light there was. I'm not a small guy myself. I'm about 6'1", around 230 pounds. I don't usually feel physically intimidated just walking down the street. This guy made me feel small. As I passed them, I noticed him mid-conversation, his head turning slightly as I went by. I didn't look directly at him, but I felt that shift in attention. The subtle break in rhythm when someone locks onto something new. I told myself not to overthink it. People look at each other all the time. That alone doesn't mean anything. I turned the corner into a dark alley. It wasn't a shortcut exactly, just the route I usually took. The alley connected streets in a way that saved a few minutes. I'd walked it dozens of times without incident. It wasn't pitch black, but it was dim enough that details softened. Brick walls on either side, a dumpster halfway down. The sound of the street faded quickly behind me. That's when I heard footsteps. At first, I thought it was my own echo. The alley amplified sound in strange ways. But after a few steps, it became clear that someone else had turned in behind me. I glanced back, just enough to confirm what my body already knew. It was him, the large guy from the restaurant. He had stopped talking to his friends and followed me around the corner. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't looking around. He was walking directly behind me, his pace deliberate, unhurried, like he'd already decided where he was going. I felt that cold drop in my stomach, the one that doesn't come with panic right away, just awareness. I sped up. So did he. Not dramatically, not running, just matching my pace, keeping the distance closed. Close enough that the sound of his footsteps didn't fade, close enough that I knew this wasn't coincidence. The alley felt longer than it ever had before. My mind started racing through possibilities. Maybe he just lived nearby. Maybe he was going the same way. Maybe I was misreading everything. But my body didn't believe that. My body was already preparing for something else. I could hear his breathing now. That was the moment fear really set in. Not abstract fear, not imagination. Real, physical fear. The sound was too close. He wasn't hanging back. He wasn't giving space. He was right there, filling the narrow alley behind me with his presence. I thought about my guitar. It was expensive, not flashy, but valuable. Slung across my back in a way that made me slower. I'm more awkward if I needed to move fast. I pictured him grabbing it, yanking me back, slamming me into the brick wall. I pictured fists, the weight difference, the fact that even if I fought back, this wouldn't be quick or clean. I've never felt so aware of my own vulnerability. I wasn't thinking about pride or toughness. I wasn't thinking about standing my ground. I was thinking about survival, about getting out of that alley without finding out what he wanted. I sped up again. He closed the gap. At that point, I knew I couldn't let this continue. If I reached the middle of the alley, I'd be too far from the street to react quickly, too boxed in, too alone. I reached the end of the alley and made a split-second decision. Instead of continuing forward, I crossed the street. Right across, without hesitation, into the glow of a pub. There were people outside standing in a loose circle, smoking, laughing, talking loudly. The kind of casual public presence that immediately changes the energy of a situation. The moment I stepped into that light, everything shifted. I didn't look back right away. I didn't want to draw attention. I just slowed my pace, blended into the edge of the group, pretending I belonged there. Then I glanced over my shoulder. He had stopped. He stood at the edge of the alley for a second, just long enough for our eyes to meet. His face was unreadable. No anger, no surprise, just calculation. Then he turned around and walked back the way he came, disappearing around the corner toward his friends. Just like that. No confrontation, no words, no explanation. I stood there for a moment longer, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The people around me had no idea what had just happened. To them, it was just another night, another person joining the crowd for a cigarette or some air. I didn't tell anyone. I waited until my hands stopped shaking. Then I went home a longer way, sticking to well-lit streets, replaying every second in my head. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, I woke up to news that made my blood run cold. There had been a robbery at a gas station, the kind that sticks in the local news cycle, because it hits close to home. The report said a group of men had been involved. They had been stalking people at the pumps, especially women, watching them from a distance, waiting for the right moment. One person had been robbed. Others had been followed but managed to get away. The description of the suspects matched the group I had seen outside the restaurant. Same area, same time frame, same kind of behavior. I sat there, staring at the screen, feeling a strange mix of relief and nausea. Relief that I hadn't been hurt, nausea at how close it had been, at how easily I could have been the one in that article instead of just reading it. I kept thinking about the timing. If I hadn't crossed the street when I did, if there hadn't been people outside that pub, if I'd hesitated for even a few more seconds. I don't know what he planned to do. Maybe it was just the guitar. Maybe it was more than that. I'll never know, and honestly, I don't want to. What stays with me isn't the fear itself, but how quiet it all was. No shouting, no threats, no dramatic buildup. Just a man deciding to follow someone into a dark space and seeing how far he could take it. That's what scares me the most. Not the idea of violence, but how ordinary it can feel while it's happening. How quickly a normal walk home can turn into something dangerous without any obvious warning. I still walk at night sometimes. I don't want to live in fear. But I'm different now. More aware, more cautious. I notice reflections in windows. I listen to footsteps. I trust my instincts faster instead of second-guessing them. Every now and then, when I sling my guitar over my shoulder after a show, I think about that alley, about the sound of breathing behind me, about the moment I stepped into the light and everything changed. And I remind myself how lucky I was, not because I fought someone off, not because I was stronger or smarter, just because I crossed the street at the right time. Look, if you're still watching, you already know what this channel is. No jump scares, no fake drama, just real stories about real people who survive things most of us can't even imagine. And that's scarier than any movie could ever be. If you want more of this raw, unfiltered truth, told the way it deserves to be told, subscribe to Lacuna Noir. We're not here to waste your time. We're here to tell the stories that actually matter. Thanks for listening. Now go get some sleep, if you can.